Hey, thank you so much for joining our channel today. I hope to do more of these videos, and I hope that you find them helpful. Thought I'll shoot outside. The sun is shining. It's very lovely today, so I thought, hey, what better lighting than the sunshine itself? But anyway, I want to speak to you today about facing the worst. Facing the worst. I have some notes here, so if you see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes because I really want to get this across in the best way possible. Every single one of us understands that in any situation we find ourselves, there is a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is the worst possible option in any situation you find yourself. In some situations, some people see death as the worst case scenario. For some, it might be the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, the failure of a relationship. It might be sickness, it might be whatever. There is always something that appears to be the worst case scenario in every situation. And I think that in order for us to be people who thrive, people who are really healthy in our lives, we need to have the right attitude and the right approach to the worst case scenario. When we don't have the right approach or the right attitude to the worst case scenario, I've put down a few things that happen here. We get to the place where we handle it in two ways. It's either we obsess about the worst case scenario and try and pre-plan and take care of everything ahead of time so that the worst case scenario would not happen, or we bury our heads in the sand and you know, use religious jargon sometimes or whatever to block away the possibility of the worst case scenario. Both ways are not the way to deal with that, are not the healthiest ways to deal with the worst case scenario. And hopefully I have made 2 or 3 points that will help you handle the worst case, or think about the worst case scenario right, and also to handle it correctly. First thing you need to know about the worst case scenario. There is a scripture I love so much. In the book of Psalms 112 verse 7. It says that, talking about the people of God, it says that they will have no fear of bad news. Their hearts are steadfast, trusting the Lord. They will have no fear of bad news. Here is the first approach that we need to have towards the worst case scenario. Accept that bad things happen. I know you've been praying against it, but bad things will happen. The Bible never promises a life without the worst happening to you. There is no promise that you will live a life where, as long as you are on this earth, where the worst case scenario never ever happens. It says in this scripture that they would not fear it. It didn't say that bad news will not come. It just says that we will not fear it. And when we don't have the right approach to handling the worst, we live life afraid, constantly afraid by the worst case scenario. And this is how I like to put it. When you are afraid of something, anything you are afraid of has the ability to bully you, has the ability to rob you of the joy of what is now, the present, current circumstance that you find yourself in. So here is the first step to dealing with the worst case scenario, the worst thing that can happen. The first step to dealing with it is understanding and realizing that the reality of living is that sometimes the worst happens. Particularly those of us who are people of faith, we think that faith is the absence of storms, but the word never promises that. God has never promised you a life without the worst thing. Even the worst case scenario happened to Jesus, and so it will happen to you and me. And what I'm saying is that in our expectation of good, it is important that we brace ourselves for the worst happening. He says we will not fear the worst. It is possible to brace yourself for the worst case scenario without necessarily being afraid that it's going to take you out. So the point I'm making is the first thing we've got to do, whether it's in your marriage, whether it's in your health, whether it's with your children, regardless of the stage of life you find yourself in, you've got to accept that bad things will happen. The worst often happens. And the promise of God for those of us who believe Him is that we will not be afraid of bad news. Practice looking the worst in the eye. Here's what I tell people. I tell people, what is the worst you are afraid of? What is the worst you were afraid of? Why don't you travel to that place in your imagination? Let's say in your job, you're constantly afraid that your boss doesn't like you, and because he doesn't like you, he's going to fire you one day. And you have two options. You can keep coming into work afraid that this might be the day that I get fired, or if you are worried about dying, you can wake up every day you're alive and consistently worry about the fact that this might be the day that you die. Or this might be the day that cancer returns, or this might be the day they find out what you did when you were when the mistake you made. All kinds of things that bother us. Look it in the eye. Don't be afraid to look it in the eye. You have what is required in your imagination. Square up to the worst case scenario. Visit it. Go there. I'm not afraid to consider the day that I die. I'm not afraid to think about what happens if ministry falls apart. I'm not afraid to think about what happens, what the situation will be if my relationships fall apart. No, I'm not praying that any of these things happen, but I refuse to be afraid to live life consistently afraid of these things happening. Because if you don't go there, the enemy will give you an imagination of what it looks like that differs from the will of God for your life. The reason it's important for you to go there, and the third thing that you need to do is, when you go there, find Jesus there. Find the answer there. Because God has already made preparations for the worst case scenario. If the business falls apart, or if it doesn't work as you thought that it should work, or if things don't work out as you were expecting them to work out, don't be afraid of that. Understand this truth, that even if that happens, the promise that God has given you is that He will be with you. He said, I will be with you through the water. I will be with you through the fire. I will be with you wherever you go. That's the promise of the scripture. That is the promise that God has given you. And then the final thing I want to say, so I've said 3 things so far. Number 1, accept that the worst happens. It is part of life. Number 2, accept, what did I say is number 2? Look the worst in the eye. Don't be afraid to look it in the eyes. You are not designed to be afraid of the worst. Look bad news in the eye. Look the worst situation in the eye. Number 3, understand that even if the worst happens, the promise that God has given you is that He will be with you. He will be with you. And then number 4, the fourth thing I'd recommend that you do is to now, having been to the worst case scenario, having visited that situation, rewind and come back to the present. Because oftentimes the things that we worry about are never really happen, or are things that we are worried will happen in the future of some sort. Come back into the present and begin to exercise your faith for the best. Okay? Exercise your faith for the best. God gave us a relationship by faith so that we can rely on Him, rely on His strength, rely on His ability, even when we don't have the ability. So visit the worst case scenario, understand that God is there, then come back. If it's death that you are constantly afraid of worrying about, visit that place of death. Imagine what will happen if you died. Imagine what will happen if your children see that Jesus, God, will be there. He will look after your children. He will look after your family. He will look after your estate. You will be in heaven. Go there. And when you go there, the enemy loses his power to bully you with that. So if it's that, go there and imagine all these things. Now return to where you are and understand that the promise of God concerning your life is that with long life He will satisfy you. So we are not afraid of dying. Paul put it this way. He says, to be with the Lord is better for me, but to be here is better for you. In other words, I have been to the place of my death, and I'm not even afraid of what happens. I understand that that is a good thing if that happens. But the reason I am here is that I am exercising exercising my faith to complete the will of God for my life in this area. So visit the place of your death if if it's what you are worried about. Then return to the present and exercise your faith in the promise of God concerning your life. So if it's the job you're worried about losing, no, visit the place where you understand that even if I lose this job, God is my source. So when I visit there and understand, no, I'm not afraid of losing this job, you can return to where you are and say, well, God has given me this job. He has opened that door. He has given me the promise. So he has also given me the grace to do the job well. I am not afraid of misbehaving and losing my job. I'm not afraid of losing my relationship, because if that happens, God will be with me. But I don't want a relationship that didn't work. I want to experience the goodness of God. I want to experience the joy of a great relationship. And so we return, and now our relationship with God is not fear-based but completely faith-based. I hope that you are going to live your life without consistently and constantly being afraid of the worst case scenario. It's time to be set free. This is why Jesus came, to set us free from fear. We want to hear your thoughts. What ways have you learned to deal with a worst case scenario in your life? Maybe you can share them in the comments so that we can have that conversation together. God bless you. I am Chido Gideon, and yeah, see you soon.